Hello and welcome to the instructions for the upcoming midterm for History 411. The midterm is scheduled for Wednesday, October 18th, 2017. It will take place from 2 to 3:15 p.m., which is, of course, the time for our regular class meeting. I know that we haven't met in class at that time yet, so this will be our first face-to-face class meeting again in this blended course. What you've been doing so far in class, as you know, has been basically completely online. In terms of listening to the lectures and turning in your assignments and participating in discussion. But so this will be our first face-to-face meeting for the midterm. So again, from 2 to 3:15 p.m. on Wednesday, October 18th. And it will take place in class, in our classroom at our scheduled class time, which is in Arts and Letters room 204. So make sure, if you haven't been to that classroom yet, make sure that you know where it is and that you are on time, or I would recommend trying to be there at least a few minutes early, because we will start the midterm right at 2 o'clock. I'll be there to hand out the exams, and so you'll want to make sure that you're there on time so that you don't miss a minute of the exam, of the time that you have to write the exam, to answer the questions in the exam. So on that day, I would also like you to bring a blue book to class with you, and you're welcome to write in the blue book in pencil or pen. Whatever you prefer is fine with me, but I do want you to bring a blue book, and you can bring either a small one or a large one, whichever size you prefer. And what I will ask you to do is, right at 2 o'clock, I will ask you to hand in your blue books to me, and then I'll actually redistribute them, and we'll do my very, very best to give you back the same size blue book that you brought in. And I should say I haven't actually used blue books in a few years, so I'm not even sure if they still have the two different sizes. So if they don't worry about it. But if they still do, like I said, we'll make sure that you get back the size of the blue book that you brought in. But I do that in order to make sure that people wouldn't sort of write things in the blue book ahead of time, and in that way try to cheat. I truly don't believe that any of you would have cheating in mind coming into the exam, but I like to do this just to kind of head off any possibilities like that. So you'll bring it in. So don't put your name on it or anything. Just bring in a blue book, then you'll hand it in to me, and then I will redistribute them to you, then hand out the exam question, and then you'll go ahead and get started. And while we're going through the exam, I will actually help keep track of time and let you know how much time has gone by and how many minutes are left, in as unobtrusive a way as possible, so as not to sort of distract you, but just to have you kind of keep in mind what the time frame is and how much time you have left. Okay, so in terms of just some more basic logistics about the midterm, it is worth 25% of your grade, and the format of it will be that you will be asked to answer what I call the IDs that I had talked about, in some of the first lectures and in the instructions for the course. And then you'll also be answering an essay question. And so I will spend some time, in this video talking in some detail about what I mean by IDs and how to go ahead and try to answer an ID, and what is expected, what you can kind of expect from an essay question as well. I will say right now I do not hand out review sheets that have possible essay questions on them or the list of IDs. What I do is, in the course, I've tried to provide that kind of scaffolding for you to be able to put together yourself. And again, I'll talk a little bit more about that later on when I talk about how to prepare for the exam and what to expect. So what's going to be coming then is what I'm going to spend the rest of this time talking about is what to expect in the midterm, and then how to prepare for it. So in the first place on the exam, you will expect to see, you will have sort of at the top of the exam will be a list of terms, and you will choose terms, either 2 or 3 terms from that list um, to identify. And I just want to say a couple of things about that. On the exam, I will tell you about how much time to spend on each of the IDs and on the essay question based on the percentage of the grade that the ID is. Usually the exam consists of about 50 to 60% of the exam grade, and then the IDs will be about, between 40 and 50%. So either somewhere between about 20% each or 25% each. The IDs will be 20 to 25% each of the grade. And like I said, well, let me just back up. If this sounds a little bit confusing, I will actually have this spelled out in the exam. I'll say, you're going to answer, 2 or 3, choose 2 or 3 of these terms, and then, plan to spend no more than X amount of time on that. And again, that will be based on the percentage of the grade that the ID is, so that you're spending the amount of time on that part of the exam that's proportional to the percentage of the grade that it is. So in other words, you don't want to spend, an hour of your hour and 15 minutes on the IDs if they're only worth, say, 40% of the exam. You don't want to spend, 80% of the exam time on something that's only worth 40% of the grade. So instead, you want to spend about 40% of the exam time on that part. And I will calculate that for you, though. So you can definitely expect that when you come in to take the exam. You will also definitely have a choice of the IDs that you want to answer. I'll give you a list of, 6 or 8 IDs. Actually, I should scale that back. Probably about between 4 and 6 IDs, and ask you to choose 2 or 3 of those to identify. So what do I want to see in those identifications, in those IDs? What you want to do is you want to identify and describe whatever the term is. So you want to give the basic who, what, when and where of the place. So say this is an ID that you choose is the Code of Hammurabi. Then you would want to talk about, what is it? What is this thing? What is the Code of Hammurabi? Who was responsible for at least putting it together? Who's responsible for, who was the leader in place who put this code together and then was responsible for enforcing this code? So obviously Hammurabi. Who is he? When did he live? When does this law code come about? Where does it appear? And so, kind of giving the basic outlines of what this thing is. So you're identifying it and describing it. But that's not all you want to do. And in fact, in some ways, the most significant part of the ID comes in explaining its significance. Why is this thing important? How did it come about? What is its historical significance? What I call the so what. So what about this thing? Why is it so important that I as your professor have singled that term out from all of the other, hundreds of things that could have been brought to your attention from all of this material that's being presented in the modules? Why these particular, 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 terms, in each module? Why are these things singled out as being particularly significant? And oftentimes that significance will come because, the ID is something that is an important thing that characterizes a particular age, that shows you a lot about a society, or it can be important because it signifies a certain what we call watershed period in history, a time when a lot of changes came about because of this thing or as the consequence of this thing, or perhaps the idea it sort of signifies the effects of a whole lot of changes. So what you want to be doing with that idea is basically placing it within historical context. Why is it historically significant? Does it, as I said, does it represent something particularly important about a society or about a particular era? Does it signify some major change or the consequence of a change? So what's the bigger picture? Where does it fit into the historical context? Where does it fit into that bigger picture of the historical development that we're looking at in this class? And in that way, this is something that's more up for interpretation. I mean, there are some things I'm going to be looking for in terms of historical significance, but what each person writes in an ID is will be different from the others in the class, and so that is sort of weighed more, less on, how can I say this? This is less objective than saying, okay, what was the Code of Hammurabi? When was it put in place? Who's responsible for it? Who's, pointing to Hammurabi as sort of the progenitor of this law code. This is more, why is this law code important and what does it show us about this particular society? And each of you will have your own interpretation and your own answer for that. And so I weigh those very much on an individual case-by-case basis. Like I said, there's a sort of a skeleton, an outline of what I want to see. But some people will emphasize one particular aspect of its significance at the expense of something else. But if they've done a really good job explicating it, if they don't have as much on some other aspect, I will weigh that on an individual basis, and I make sure that I give you comments back about each of the IDs too, so that if you don't get full credit on it, then you can know what was it that you missed here to think about for the future. And it's really helpful to think about these IDs more as mini essays than as definitions. I've had students in the past say that, in other classes, the professor did not want to hear all kinds of, detail about a particular definition. They just want this very straightforward sort of one sentence answer. That is not the case for me. What I want to see is an in-depth discussion, as in-depth as you can make it, about what this thing is, what this term is, or what this term means, and its significance within history. And so if you've written a sentence or two or a line or two in your blue book, that generally speaking is not going to be enough to have written a sufficient ID. I really shy away from saying, how many pages the essay should be, or what's the length of a good ID, because some people will write a lot in just a few words, and other people will take many words to explain relatively straightforward things. For instance, somebody could write 2 pages in a blue book on an ID and still not have gotten to the heart of its significance. Somebody else might write a half a page and have been able to delve into more discussion of significance than someone who wrote 2 pages. That said, I should say too, some people write very, small letters, and some people write really big. So it just, you really can't put any kind of page minimum or maximum on this. But I will say, if you've written 1 or 2 sentences for an ID, it's probably not enough. Just like for your module assignments, if you've been able to answer this question in 1 line, 1 sentence, I can guarantee 1 sentence is not going to be enough, unless it's a super long run-on sentence, which I doubt it's going to be, one sentence is not going to be enough. One line is not going to be enough. I would say generally to get the information you need out, you want to, you would want to be writing probably a page or more for the IDs. But again, that said, I'm very wary of putting a lot, sort of a page limit on this. But think of it as a mini essay. And, I've definitely seen cases where 2/3 of a page, 3/4 of a page has done it. And again, has been sufficient. And again, it depends on the size of the blue book and that kind of thing. But what I would say is you want a fully fleshed out answer as much as you possibly can. Write it in paragraph form, and it's probably going to be a pretty substantial paragraph that you're going to be writing, or again, think of it in terms of a mini essay, to do a sort of fully explicated, fully explained ID. I also want to go through just an example of an ID so that you can get a sense of the scope of it, because you're probably starting to get a sense that, wow, these IDs aren't just sort of straightforward identification. Oh, the Code of Hammurabi was a law code from 1800 BC in Mesopotamia, but much more in depth than that. So why don't I take that one as an example to just sort of explain what I would expect to see in an ID that would receive sort of an A grade. Oh, sorry. So if say that, on the exam, the Code of Hammurabi is one of those 4 to 6 terms that's listed, and you choose to write about that one. That's one of your IDs you're going to write about. What I would do is, start out with thinking about, or identifying it right away. What is it? Okay, so this is a law code developed under the ruler Hammurabi around 1800 BC in Mesopotamia. This is part of, let's see, so we've identified, who, what, where, when. But what is important about the Code of Hammurabi? So in that, what you would want to do then is place it in its historical context. So you might want to talk about, you might want to go as far as to talk about the old Babylonian Empire that it comes out of, the history of Mesopotamia as an early complex society, the fact that it had started out as this very decentralized place, largely due to its geography and kind of lack of the regular flooding of its rivers. And so you see different cities, different urban areas that are established but that are walled, that have their own particular cultural characteristics, their own gods and that kind of thing. That but then as the development of Mesopotamia, I don't know a better word to say it, develops further, you start to see a shift from the sort of southern region of Mesopotamia further to the north, and then over time a gradual consolidation of this society under imperial rule. You see the Akkadian Empire with Sargon as one example of it, and then another layer of it coming with Hammurabi and the establishment of the old Babylonian Empire. And that along with this consolidation of rule comes, a whole bunch of things that are put in place by Sargon and then extended by Hammurabi. A law code that was put together that is significant for a number of reasons. And so in one sense, just by laying out that larger history of Mesopotamia, you've placed this law code within a large historical context and shown that this law code is part of the consolidation of rule in Mesopotamia, and particularly of sort of ordered imperial rule. And then the characteristics of this law code that you'll go on to describe illustrate the particular context that it was developed in. Because it is such a harsh law code, as many of you pointed out in your module, um, assignments. Basically, this law code is based on the idea of the lex talionis, or the idea of an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, because literally in this law code, if somebody puts out your eye, then they're going to have their eye put out. If somebody puts out your tooth, then they're going to have their tooth pulled as well. This is a law code based on something called reflexive justice, so lex talionis, in which you cut off somebody's hand, you're going to have your hand cut off. You're going to have exactly the same punishment done to you that you did, that you did to somebody else. And this particularly harsh law code was necessary in this harsh environment of Mesopotamia, where for so long it had been quite decentralized and there was a lot of instability and sort of people living just for the moment. And so these rulers who are trying to forge these ordered, stable societies out of this harsh environment, then they have to have a really harsh law code in order to kind of keep people in line, in order to make sure that people are doing what they're supposed to within this society. So the nature of the law code then shows you something about the nature of the society it was governed, and is a consequence of that society as well. So here you have another kind of historical significance, placing this law code and its characteristics within this historical context. You can see another aspect of its historical significance. Another aspect of the Code of Hammurabi and what it shows us about this society is what many of you pointed out in your assignments as well, is the fact that the laws did not apply equally to everyone. Slaves tended to be punished much more harshly than free people and noblemen. And women and men had different different standards applied to them as well. Although, as many of you pointed out, women did have a number of legal protections within this society, but the law didn't apply equally to each member of society as it theoretically does in our society today. This was emphatically not the case under, in the old Babylonian Empire. And so that shows you, again, their social structure as well, and that some people had far more rights, far more legal rights than others, or some would be punished far more harshly than others for the exact same crime. Or if something happened, if a crime were committed against a slave, that person would be punished much less harshly than, say, if a crime were committed against, someone in the nobility or a free person. So depending on your place in society, and if you were a man or a woman, the laws applied differently to you based on your place in this society. So that's another characteristic of this law code that, again, like I said, can tell you and show you something about social hierarchy within this society. And the fact that what might be considered fair or unfair today was quite different in 1800 BC in Mesopotamia, again, because I think of the very, very harsh conditions that this society was forged in. So as you can see, then all of this would be possible information to include in an ID. And so you can see how they can actually end up being pretty substantial. I mean, you're going to be writing within a time limit, so you want to really keep track of that and be careful to really stay on point, and really be careful to prioritize your ideas, and the order of ideas within the ID, and try to get as much pertinent information out as possible about the ID and its significance. You don't have to have every single point that I just outlined by any means, but those are all possible aspects that you could include within this ID. And the more you can get out, and the more you can explain and show connections and show significance, the better. But that's sort of the range of possible information that could go into the ID. So I'm happy to talk with you about this more and explain, explain things further. If you're feeling intimidated, if you're feeling nervous about this, feel free to email me, come see me in office hours. I'm more than happy to help explain things further. I'd be happy to go over other IDs with you, although I won't, in this case, I just sort of set the answer out there. If I'm going to go over things with you, I'm going to be asking you, okay, what do you think the significance is of this ID? I want you to place it within historical context. So I won't be just sort of giving away the answer, but I'm happy to talk with you about this and help to explicate, what might be some possibilities for significance here in order to help you in terms of your thinking and preparation for the exam. And another thing I'll talk about in a few minutes that can be really helpful for IDs is to quiz yourself on it. Okay, so what's the who, what, where, when here? But what's the significance too? What is the significance of this ID? Let me place it in historical context. And you'll also see that oftentimes nice detailed descriptions will lead you into significance as well. For instance, a really nice detailed description of the law code as the lex talionis, using the lex talionis, the eye for an eye, reflexive justice, and the fact that you have different punishments for different levels of society. Those are describing the law code, but they're going to lead you right into the idea that this is a harsh, really, strict law code that is suited and tailored toward this very harsh society and developed because of that. So now let's move on to the essay question that will be on the exam. And what you will have on the exam is a choice of at least two different questions to choose from. So you'll have the IDs on the sheet, and then you'll also have the essay section of the exam. And just like with the IDs, I'll let you know about how much time you should plan to spend on the essay, again based on the percentage that it's worth of the exam. Then I make that proportional to the amount of time that you should spend on the question, on answering the essay question. So you'll have 2 or 3 essay questions there to choose from. And generally, in terms of what to expect for the essay questions, they will be based on lecture readings and videos. So they will ask you to draw material from each aspect of the course. And I should say that's true of the IDs as well. For instance, if, say you have the Code of Hammurabi as one of the IDs, then I would expect you to be able to talk about, things that you had read about in the primary sources, from that. So think about, for IDs and essay, including material that you learned in the videos, in the History Channel videos, and, the Engineering and Empire, and the various videos you've watched for each module, as well as the information that's included in the lecture, as well as the textbook reading and the primary source readings, and then the articles. For instance, if you were going to be talking about the axial age, You want to think about material that was included in the Carlton Tucker article about the axial age as well. So you want to bring in material from all the course materials presented in the different modules. And in addition to that, in terms of what to expect for the essay question, these questions are going to be big, broad questions. And in a world history course like this, they are generally going to be comparative questions in which you're asked to compare developments within different societies. That's usually kind of the scope of a question like this. There is also the possibility of questions that look at long-term historical developments, particularly for this class, Paleolithic, say to Neolithic to complex society, or the importance of the Indo-European migrations and the Iron Age for the axial age that comes in, or sort of big sort of developments that have big long-term consequences. You want to, those are the sorts of things that the essay questions tend to be focused on. I'm not going to ask you an essay question that asks you to discuss the concept of karma, for example. I certainly could ask a question in which karma, the concept of karma, is going to be a part of the answer, but I'm not going to ask you that specific of an essay question. Generally, it's going to be something that brings together a few different modules worth of material, in a sense. So it's going to be sort of bigger, broader questions. And I should say right now too, I meant to say this before I concluded the IDs, but since I talked about the Code of Hammurabi as an example, I would not put that in to the exam. So you would not have the Code of Hammurabi in the midterm. You can count on that. So anyway, let me move on then. In terms of the essay question, actually, let me go back one more thing about what to expect here in the essay question is I tend to write kind of relatively long essay questions as well. They're sort of more of a paragraph than just one straight question. And that is not meant to intimidate you, but rather to actually help you as you take the exam. It's much more difficult to have an essay question that says, discuss the rise of the axial age or something, or discuss the causes and consequences of the axial age. You certainly could ask something like that, and I'm sure you guys could answer that based on what you've learned in class. But what I tend to do is start with some an introductory sentence or two about, okay, we've covered this this particular aspect of world history in the class, and then I will go into kind of the heart of the question. There's going to be sort of a basis of the question, a basic thing that you're going to be answering. But then I will go into a series of questions or statements that are designed to help you think about how to answer this basic question, and then how to structure your answer. And then there's often sort of a concluding evaluative question that says, okay, based on this, how would you compare or contrast this? Or what's your I'm thinking of that Code of Hammurabi question that I asked, do you think this is fair or not? Or some sort of concluding kind of question in which you would sort of evaluate or compare the societies that you've been talking about. For the concluding part of the essay, what I would say is don't spend a whole lot of time on that particular aspect of the essay. That's just, a couple of sentences at the end, some overall conclusions. But what I really want you to spend your time doing is writing out the sort of the main body of the essay and answering the question in the way that I'm kind of laying out in that paragraph. And so along those lines too, what I recommend that you do is when you get the exam, read it over, decide which IDs you're going to answer, and then decide which essay you're going to answer. And you can do the exam in any order you want. You can start with the essay and then do the IDs. You can do, ID, then essay, then ID. It's totally up to you. But once you choose the essay that you're going to be answering, then I highly recommend you go through and underline the heart of the question, sort of what's the basic thing that I'm talking about here, what's the basic question I'm answering, and then the sort of the supporting parts of it, what based on, you know, the rest of what's in this question, what are the different ways that I'm going to be answering that basic question? How am I going to structure my answer to this basic question? I also recommend that you take a couple of minutes to do an outline, and feel free to just, you know, scribble on the first page of the blue book, scribble it out. It doesn't have to be neat. You can write, you know, right on that inside cover of the blue book if you prefer. And you, I wouldn't spend more than literally a minute or two, maybe 3 minutes at the most. So don't do anything, you know, I wouldn't recommend any big, long, formal, you know, outline, nothing like a, you know, no kind of sentence outline, but just a couple of words that can help you to keep on track and be sure that you're structuring the essay in the way you need to answer the question. And again, I think it'll be very obvious from the way that the question that the essay question is written out, how, you know, what you need to do. But I do recommend, you know, doing a brief outline. I will also say that if, say, you're writing along in the essay and then you suddenly realize you left out, you know, some important piece of information from an early that you should have put earlier, feel free to put a little asterisk there, and then, you know, or write an arrow and say, you know, turn to this page, or, you know, write it along the side. And then if you have any issues or concerns about it, you can just show it to me or explain it to me, and I'm happy to, you know, sort of skip a couple pages and then read that part and then come back to the essay. So don't worry about that at all, as long as it's, you know, sort of clear to me what's there. And basically, I try to give you the benefit of every doubt in these exams. And if you say you run out of time, but you've done an outline and I see some points that you didn't get to because you didn't, you know, because you ran out of time, then I can give you a couple of points, because I can say, okay, yeah, he or she knew these points, they just didn't get to them, or they didn't, you know, explain them in depth. So that's where sort of outlines can help. And also feel free to just, you know, write something in at the last minute if you suddenly remember something. Just, you know, write it in, and I'm happy to look at it. And sometimes, you know, sometimes, you know, it can help to get a couple of more points. So I'm happy to work with you on that kind of thing. And I know that these are timed, you know, how can I say, these are you know, pressured times where you really have to prioritize quickly. I know that there's a lot of time pressure in a timed exam like this, so I'm happy to work with you on that. Let's see. Also, I should say this too. If you're feeling really anxious about it, just send me an email, and I'm happy to talk to you about it. I'm happy to give you some pointers on, you know, test anxiety. If you feel any kind of anxiety, especially if you feel like it's going to keep you from doing the very best job you can, just talk to me. I'm very, very happy to go over this with you, and I've done that many times in the past, and I think that it can really help. So I'm happy to help, you know, support your process as you prepare for this exam. Okay, so I guess that's some advice already, and let me just continue on with some other basic advice. Oh, as I was said already, I would recommend you make a brief outline of the answer to keep on track, so I already talked about that. And then in terms of the structure of your essay, like I said, the question should lead you very obviously into the structure of your essay, but generally the way that your essay should be organized, the basic structure of an essay in an essay exam, is that it will have a brief introduction, and then it will have a series of what we call body paragraphs, and then a brief conclusion. So the introduction will basically kind of restate the question that the essay is asking. And so just, you know, briefly write a couple of sentences about, okay, you know, here's these two societies and this is how they compare, or whatever they end up, asking you about. Do not spend a lot of time on writing the perfect introduction. This exam is not testing your writing in the same way that a formal paper is going to be looking at your writing. I know that this is a time that you're under extreme time pressure and you're trying to write as quickly as you can. So don't worry about crafting the perfect introduction. Just, what I would say is write out what you need to in order to kind of place yourself within the essay and get things going. But again, don't spend a whole lot of time on it. Where you really want to spend the vast bulk of your time is in the body paragraphs. This is when you're making those comparisons between these societies, or when you're looking at these long-term developments and you're bringing in the specifics about these places, or about this, this historical development. This is where you're showing me what you know and what you've learned in the class, and the more specific you can be, the better. So say you're talking about ancient Mesopotamia, then I want to see, I'd like to see you talk about, say, or what I was going to say is, if you're talking about ancient Mesopotamia and then the consolidation of empire, don't just say, and then they established laws. Say, and then in 1800 BC, the Code of Hammurabi was established, and then go on to, describe this law code and how it fits into the society. Things like that, where you can be as specific as possible. And again, this is where you show me what you know. And then you will, once you have, put that information out there, then you will conclude your essay. Again, just a few sentences, and usually this is answering kind of that last question in the larger essay question, where again I might ask you to sort of evaluate something, or compare and contrast, or something like that, or make some sort of overall comparison. And again, this is a few sentences. You don't feel like then I want to see the bulk of the essay on your commentary about how much you think these societies are alike or different. That's I want to see contained in, again, just a couple of sentences in a conclusion. What I really want to see are specifics from the class in the main body paragraph. So if you have a conclusion that goes on for 3 or 4 pages, again, that's not going to get you a whole lot of points. What really gets you the points, where you earn the most points for the essay, is in those body paragraphs. So that's how you want to kind of structure it, and then kind of what you can expect from the essay questions. So now I just want to talk about how to, my advice for how you can prepare for the exam. In the first place, I recommend reviewing your reading and lecture notes. So hopefully you've been taking notes, particularly for the lectures, along with the lectures. And what I recommend that you do is that you go back through and review those notes. And if there's anything you have questions about, or you don't really remember very well, the nice thing about having those lectures available is that you can go back and you can listen to it again. But the flip side of that, or the dangers of that, can be that you might feel like, oh, I have to go back and listen to every single lecture, and that is that would be excessive. So hopefully you've been taking notes and kind of following along, and then you can review your notes. At the same time, each of you has your own studying style, so you do what you feel is necessary for you to get as prepared as possible for this exam. But this is how I did things. When I was an undergraduate taking history classes, what I used to do is go through. I would take notes on my reading, take notes on my lectures, on the lectures, and then I would go back through those, and then I would actually, on like 1 or 2 pieces of paper and like small, with little writing, I would writing very small, I would actually make a timeline down one side of the page, and then put the kinds of different events that that took place, not because I'm really into dates myself, but because when you do that kind of thing, you can actually really see a lot of cause and effect. Like when major events come, you can look at, what brought those about. And so I used to do that, and then just use that as my study sheet, and then that's kind of, I would sort of read over that and try to kind of memorize what was on those pages. And for you, I don't know if chronology can be helpful for the overall picture, but the way this course is set up is much more in terms of different complex societies. And so what I would do is maybe have, an initial chronology of evolution of humans, Paleolithic, Neolithic, agricultural revolution, development of complex societies, and then you could have a section for each of those societies, something along those lines. Again, this is just sort of what I would do if I were you, but everybody studies in a different way, so it's really up to you in terms of what your style is. Oh, and one other thing actually I want to just say before I go on to this next point is that I'm not a big fan of memorizing a lot of dates, but there are some key dates that I've talked about throughout the lectures that I do recommend that you commit to memory. Some major events like evolution of humans, agricultural revolution, transition to Neolithic, agricultural revolution. When do we see the first complex sort of truly urbanized societies? And then another major event we had looked at is Indo-European migrations and their impact on the axial age, and then the development of the axial age religions. So those all had dates attached to them, and I would recommend memorizing those dates. And then if you can sort of arrange things around those dates too, I think that can help to get a sense of the larger picture and cause and effect. Anyway, so moving on, I also recommend that you review your module assignments. And this is when you're going to be really happy you did those assignments, because to me, those are sort of like the same thing as your reading notes. And to a certain extent, they can really help with understanding the lectures as well, because that first question always asks you kind of what's that big picture that reviews the sort of larger major points that are made in the lecture and then the textbook as well. So I think and it's a great way to review the material that was in the primary source readings and the articles, and what the material that was in the videos, again, so that hopefully you don't feel like you have to go back and listen to all of that all over again. You've got that in your notes, and then also in these module assignments. So I recommend read over all of your module assignments, read over the comments that I made on those assignments as well, because I will put in comments if I see that there's a particular point, and usually an important point that you've missed. I'll put comments there and say, make sure that, so that those comments are basically, make sure that you understand this as well, make sure that you don't forget this as well. And if you have any questions about that, feel free to contact me. If you don't understand what I meant by the comment, or you don't understand what was missing, or the content itself, feel free to contact me. I would also recommend that you be able to identify and tell the significance of each of the IDs. And in the past, students have made like flashcards of the IDs. I think that's a great idea. And then, have your friends test you, or you can just test yourself. So, write it, write down the ID, and then on the back you can put, person, place, who, what, when, where, and then significance, obviously in abbreviated fashion. But if you can do that and test yourself, that can be very helpful too. And actually, one thing I should say about the IDs are some things lend themselves to time periods very well, and some things don't. Or I should say to specific dates. Like Code of Hammurabi, we know that's right around 1800 BCE. But for other things, say like the Indo-European migrations, that's over a much larger span of time. So there isn't an exact date for it, but there's a date range. But if it's, so if there's a specific date attached to an ID, I'd like to see it in the ID. If it's something that's sort of a more general thing that isn't necessarily attached to a particular date, then I don't need to see a specific date, but I would like to get a sense of at least, a general time period for that. Okay. And then another thing that I would recommend, and this kind of goes along with what I was saying a few minutes ago about how I used to, when I was preparing for exams, that I would write things out on the paper, and then how I would organize it if I were in this class. That's sort of more along these lines, is I would, so I'm kind of picking up that discussion again. I would recommend that you make an outline, or, on a piece of paper, however it works for you, where you put in the main features of the development of complex societies. So get a sense of that change over time, from the evolution of humans to complex societies, and then the different features of the complex societies we've been studying. And within that too, I would think about, or along those lines as well, think about the development of the axial age. That's another major historical development that has been brought up and encompassed a number of modules, basically like from module 3 to module 6. We're looking at the axial age, its development, and then different examples of axial age religions and philosophies. So these are things that have kind of long historical development. And then I would also then go from there, from looking at sort of historical developments, then go into each of these societies and perhaps outline and then compare major features of these societies. And within each of these societies, we've looked at geography, the impact of geography on the kinds of societies that developed, the importance of geographical features that led to the development of complex societies in the first place, and the kinds of coordination that was required, from river valleys and the irrigation, and then also the control of flooding that we saw particularly with China, but also then what happens in river valleys when the river overflows, and then that can lead to agriculture, and then what kinds of agriculture we see in different parts of the world, and then the importance of that agriculture. I'm thinking particularly for China of rice and rice cultivation, and then what that meant for this society, things like that. Then it's political history, the political history of these different places, like the different dynasties in China, or what we've talked about in Mesopotamia from Sumer and then moving north. And then in Egypt, we see the different several hundred-year dynasties with the different interruptions. We looked a little bit at political history in India, not as much, because what we talked about with India was the importance more of a religious and cultural unity over time, rather than unity through imperialism or political unity. So another thing to think about is some of these societies, in some of these societies, we saw a lot of stability and continuity and unity. And then in other societies, we saw a lot of instability, or continuity and unity that comes not from, political leaders, not from governments, but from religious and cultural kind of shared values. And so think about that: instability versus stability, continuity versus a much more kind of turbulent kind of history. And each of these societies, with each of these societies, we saw different features emphasized, and a lot of this goes back to geography as well. And then also, I would recommend that you have a sense of the different religions and philosophies that developed in these different areas. We certainly talked about religion in Mesopotamia, and we saw it in Egypt, with the emphasis on the afterlife and the pyramids and mummification. But we really started to emphasize this after, with the advent of the axial age, and then the rise of Judaism, of and then of the different axial ages in the different societies. In India, what we saw with the Vedic religion, and then the reaction and challenge to the Vedic religion with Jainism and Buddhism. In China, we saw the rise of Confucianism, Taoism, and legalism in response largely to this period of warring states. And then in Greece, we see the sort of secular humanist Greek philosophy that develops there. And again, looking in some detail at the geographic characteristics that led to the kinds of societies that developed in Greece, and the decentralization with the different poleis with their different political systems. But then the shared kind of the aspects of their shared heritage as well in Greece. So if you can, outline all of that, I think you'll be very, very well prepared. If you can look at the IDs and then have memorized those and have a sense of their significance, I think you would be in very, very good shape if you can do this. So if you have any questions about this, like I said, any anxieties about the exam, feel free to get in touch with me, and I'm very happy to help support you in your preparations for the exam. And so let me know if you have any questions, and good luck.